Ilara Voss had learned very early in life that the best way to survive in a palace was to be invisible. Not invisible in the way a ghost is, not cold, not frightening, but invisible the way a well-placed chair is, or a familiar painting on a wall, present, useful, completely overlooked. She had arrived at Arunhal Palace when she was 16 years old, carrying a small cloth bag with 2 dresses, a pair of worn shoes, and a letter from the regional magistrate confirming her indenture as a household servant. Her father had passed away the previous winter, leaving behind a modest debt that a 16-year-old girl with no trade skills and no living relatives had very few options to repay. The palace took her in. She was grateful. 6 years later, Ilara was 22, and she knew every corridor of Arunhal Palace better than she knew her own face. She knew which floorboards groaned in the east wing after midnight. She knew that the fountain in the winter garden attracted a particular starling every evening around dusk, and that the bird would sit on the stone edge for exactly as long as it took her to finish her evening tea, if she was lucky enough to have 20 minutes to herself. She knew that the head steward, Master Dorvel, was more likely to overlook a small mistake on days when the palace cook made his favorite soup. She was, by every measure, a model servant. She arrived before she was expected, and left after her duties were done. She did not complain. She did not gossip, at least not in the way that caused damage. And she had a quality that very few people in a place full of ambition and performance actually possessed. She was exactly who she appeared to be. She did not know that this quality was what had first caught the attention of King Kalan Dravith. Kalan had ruled Arunhal for 8 years. He was 31, broad-shouldered, and carried the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from a man who has learned to be very careful with how much he reveals. In his world, a world of shifter courts, political marriages, and alliances built on carefully worded promises, everyone performed. Everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something. He had grown so accustomed to this that he had stopped expecting anything else. He had not been looking for anything the night he first truly noticed Ilara. He had simply been working late in his private study, sitting near a window with a stack of administrative reports that needed his signature, when he heard raised voices in the corridor outside. He did not move. Listening, in his experience, was almost always more useful than acting. A senior steward was speaking, loudly, with the particular sharpness of someone who has decided that the person in front of them cannot defend themselves. A ceremonial vase had been broken. The steward was placing the blame on Ilara, who had been cleaning that corridor that afternoon. Through the narrow gap of the door, Kalan watched. What he expected was tears, or denial, or the kind of brittle silence that comes from someone who is frightened. What he got was none of those things. Ilara stood straight. She listened to the entire reprimand without interrupting. Then she apologized, not in a crumbling way, but cleanly, as one does when one accepts a consequence, even if one does not entirely accept the blame. She offered to have the cost deducted from her wages over the following months. The steward, satisfied that he had won, walked away. Ilara stood alone in the corridor for a moment. Then, very quietly, under her breath, to absolutely no one, she said, "You're welcome." Kalan sat back in his chair. He stayed there for a long time after that, looking at the door, thinking about 2 words spoken by a girl who thought no one was listening. He told himself it was nothing. He believed it, for about 2 weeks. After that, he stopped believing it, because he noticed that he had begun arranging himself to be in the same general parts of the palace where she was likely to be working. Not closely, not obviously. He was a king. He had a great deal of the palace to move through, but he was honest enough with himself, privately, in the way that one is honest only when no one is watching, to admit that the coincidences were not coincidences. He watched her help a younger maid carry a load that was too heavy, without being asked, and without mentioning it afterward. He watched her fix a candelabra that had been installed at a slight tilt, taking it down and resetting it herself on her own time, because, as she explained to no one in particular while she worked, a crooked candelabra would bother her every time she walked past it. He watched her, one cold evening, have what appeared to be a genuine, unhurried conversation with a starling sitting on a fountain's edge. That last one made him pause for longer than the others. There was something in the way she sat, relaxed in a way she was not elsewhere in the palace, completely without audience, completely without performance. that made him feel as though he had seen something real, which was, he was beginning to understand, a very rare thing in his life. During those same months, Ilara had her own difficulties. Her closest friend in the palace, a warm and practical older maid named Tova, had fallen unwell. The illness was not dangerous, but it was persistent, and the cost of a physician's care was beyond what Tova could manage on a servant's wage. Ilara quietly took on additional night duties to earn extra income and contribute to the shared servants' fund. She did not tell Tova how many extra hours she was working. She simply worked them. She noticed, with some puzzlement, that certain things around the palace began improving in ways that no one could fully explain. The leaking pipe in the servants' hall, which had been dripping steadily for 2 years, and which Master Dorvel had never found the time to repair, was fixed one morning without announcement. A particularly difficult senior maid, who had made Ilara's mornings unpleasant for most of the past year, was quietly reassigned to a position at one of the outer estates. And Tova, most surprisingly, was seen by a palace physician, the kind of physician usually reserved for the higher household staff, without any fuss or formal request that anyone could trace. Ilara was grateful for all of it. She had no idea where any of it had come from. She did not think about it too hard. She had learned that gratitude was most useful when it was not complicated by too many questions. The trouble arrived in late autumn, in the form of a duke named Heron Vale. He came to court with fine clothes, a large entourage, and a written request to purchase the service contracts of several palace staff, a fashionable thing among the nobility, to have servants who had been trained at Arenhall. His list, submitted through the correct administrative channels, included Ilara's name. Tova heard about it first and told Ilara that same evening, with a quiet urgency that Ilara had never heard from her before. Duke Heron's houses were not safe. People left and did not come back with good stories. Complaints were made and disappeared without response, because the Duke had the kind of connections that made complaints vanish. Ilara sat with this for a day. She had no power. She was a human servant, in a palace that ran on shifter hierarchy. She had no noble patron, no family with influence, no leverage of any kind. But she did have one thing. She could write clearly and correctly, and she knew exactly which administrative channel to put a written objection into. So she wrote one, a short letter, precise and calm, citing the relevant sections of palace employment law and requesting that her transfer be formally reviewed. She did not expect it to succeed. She put it into the system anyway, because it was the correct thing to do. She did not know that the letter landed on King Kaelin's desk as part of a batch of routine administrative matters. She did not know that he read it 3 times. She did not know that he called his head steward within the hour and cancelled every transfer on Duke Heron's list, or that Duke Heron's visiting permit was quietly allowed to expire without renewal. She only knew, a few days later, that the transfer was no longer happening. She exhaled slowly and went back to work. She met Kaelin properly, for the first time, by accident. She had taken a wrong corridor in an unfamiliar wing while delivering an urgent message for the head steward, and she walked around a corner and directly into the king. It was not a dramatic collision. She was not carrying anything breakable, but it was undeniable. She stepped back, immediately lowered her eyes as protocol required, and began apologizing in the composed, unhurried way she did most things. He picked up the envelope she had dropped. He held it out. She took it without looking up, and then he said, quietly, "You're the one who wrote the letter." She looked up then, because she could not help it. He was watching her with an expression she had no clean category for. It was not amusement. It was not the assessment of a superior looking at a staff member. It was attention, direct, complete, and strangely patient. She confirmed that she had written the letter. He asked what had made her think it would work. She told him, honestly, that she had not thought it would work, but that writing it had been the correct action, regardless of the outcome. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right, it was." He stepped aside, and she walked on. She stood at the end of that corridor for a moment, before continuing, trying to account for what had just happened, and finding that she could not do it in any way that made her comfortable. In the weeks that followed, he spoke to her again, not frequently, not in any way that would have looked significant to someone watching from a distance, but enough. Brief exchanges in the places they happened to occupy at the same time. He asked her once about the letter, and once about a small policy she had mentioned in it regarding servants' access to the palace physician. She answered both questions directly. He listened in the way that people who are actually interested listen, which is differently from how people listen when they are waiting for their turn to speak. The court noticed, of course. Courts always notice. The whispers began softly, then gathered. A maid with no title, no family, no wolf blood. The king pausing to speak with her in a corridor. Something must be calculated, the court decided. There must be a reason they had not seen yet. A court lady named Sauven, who had her own ambitions and her own reading of the situation, decided to remove the variable. A piece of jewelry was reported missing. It was reported missing by Sauven. It was found, by one of Sauven's own maids, in the servants' quarters, near Elara's bunk. Elara was brought before the palace magistrate on a charge of theft. She stood in that room without shaking. She stated the facts as she knew them. The evidence was circumstantial and thin, but in a dispute between a noble lady and a human servant, the weight of tradition was not in Elara's favor. Kaelin walked in at the back of the hearing and sat down. He said nothing, but when the magistrate began to deliver his ruling, Kaelin spoke. 2 sentences. The first was that the charge had no merit. The second was that he intended to review the testimony of every witness personally. He said both things in the same tone he used to sign administrative reports. Matter of fact, without heat. The magistrate reconsidered. Sauven's maid, suddenly aware of what was happening, and who was in the room, quietly withdrew her statement. The hearing closed. Elara walked out. She stood in the courtyard for several minutes after, in the cold air, putting things together. The pipe, the physician, the duke, the hearing. She was not a woman who needed events explained to her at length. She was a woman who had spent 6 years paying careful attention to how a very large and complicated place actually functioned. She knew, standing there in the cold, exactly what had been happening. She requested a formal audience with the king. It took 2 weeks to be granted. The queue for audiences was long, and she was a maid. When she finally stood before him, it was not in the throne room, but in a small, plainly furnished receiving chamber. She noted the choice. She asked him directly why he had intervened in her life, repeatedly, without telling her. He was quiet for a while. Then he told her the truth, or as much of it as he had made sense of himself. He told her about the corridor and the vase, and the 2 words she had said when she thought no one was listening. He told her that he had been paying attention for 6 months. He told her that everything he had done had been without her knowledge, and that he understood this was a presumption. He did not soften it or dress it differently. He said, "I am telling you now. What you do with that is your decision." Elara was quiet for longer than he expected. Then she said, "You could have simply introduced yourself." He said, very quietly, "I know. I was working up to it." She looked at him for a moment, this king who commanded armies and ended negotiations with 2 sentences, admitting that he had been working up his nerve. Something shifted in her chest. She was not entirely sure what it was, but she recognized that it was real. She went back to her duties. She thought for a long time. She was not a woman who rushed decisions, and she was not going to start now simply because a king was involved. Over the weeks that followed, she and Kaelin began something that had no formal name. Conversations, carefully made room in the day, questions asked and actually answered. She found, gradually, that she could breathe normally around him, that he was, in private, genuinely honest. Not comfortable, not easy, but honest. He found that she made him think more carefully, that she had no interest in telling him what he wanted to hear, that she was, in all the ways that mattered, exactly who she appeared to be, and that this, which he had spent 8 years believing did not exist in the world he occupied, was worth more to him than he had words to explain. The palace debated and whispered and took sides. His advisors warned him. The court watched with wide eyes and sharp opinions. Kaelin listened to the concerns that were reasonable, addressed the ones that were legitimate, and was unmoved by the rest. He did not rush. He did not announce. He simply made space, steadily and without fanfare, until it was no longer possible to pretend the space was not there. One evening, in late winter, Elara was sitting in the garden by the fountain. The starling was there, as it usually was. The cold had softened slightly, the way it does just before the season begins to change. and there was a thin warmth in the last light. She was holding her tea in both hands, and not thinking about anything in particular. She heard footsteps on the stone path. She did not look up immediately, because she had learned in 6 years that the garden at dusk was hers, and she was not ready to give it up yet. Then she recognized the particular quality of the quiet that settled around a certain kind of presence, and she looked up. Kalen was standing a few feet away. He was not hiding, he was not watching from a distance. He was simply there, in the garden, at dusk, with no particular pretense about it. She moved slightly on the bench. He sat down. The starling regarded both of them with the careful suspicion that small birds reserve for large, uncertain creatures, then decided they were acceptable, and stayed. They did not speak for a while. The last light moved across the stones. The garden was quiet, the way that real quiet is, full, rather than empty. Then Alara said, without looking at him, "You could have just said hello, 6 months ago." Kalen looked at the starling. "I know," he said. "I kept thinking I would find a better moment." "Did you find one?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think this one is all right." She looked at him then. He was watching her the same way he always watched her, with that complete, unhurried, entirely patient attention that she had never known what to do with, and had eventually stopped trying to escape. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a careful one, a real one, quiet and warm, the kind that surprised her slightly as it came out. It was the first time in 6 years inside those walls that she had laughed in the open air, without thinking about who might be nearby, or what it might look like. The starling, apparently unbothered, ruffled its feathers once and settled. Kalen did not say anything. He looked at her with an expression that she was only now beginning to learn the name for, and she found that she did not need him to say anything at all. The garden held them both in its last light, and the season leaned toward change, and some things, the truest ones, did not need an announcement. They simply became real, quietly, the way they had been becoming real all along.